Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 187. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. Before I get into factoring out the number 187, I would like to announce that at long last, my fourth book has been published and is available on Amazon. It's entitled Memoirs from Myanmar, which is largely autobiographical stuff about my monk's life, mainly in Burma, but also including Indonesia and the United States. And those of you who are interested may find it in the URL links below this video. Unless you're watching it on Subscribestar, in which case you're going to have to go directly to YouTube or BitChute or Rumble to find the link. And if you do read it, I would appreciate an honest review, unless it's like really negative. So, 187, a lot of you guys probably thinking, oh, that's prime. It's because you're too freaking cowardly to do the work to factor out the number. Just disgusting. Actually, it's 11 times 17, which is kind of interesting. Sort of pseudo prime. So I guess I should just commence to answering questions. And as usual lately, the first few questions, or three of the first four questions, were asked quite some time ago, and then I just overlooked them when compiling the previous list. So they're on this list up near the top of the scroll. So the first question is from Fred. And Fred says, are women an impediment to progress? And I assume he means spiritual progress. And I would say probably, well, I mean, for someone who's practicing spirituality, like for the average guy, having a woman may actually, I mean, in a lot of cases, it helps to straighten a guy out. He's gets a crash course in responsibility, that kind of thing. So for a lot of like average Joes, women can kind of improve their morality, that kind of thing. It's not always the case, but it is often the case. With regard to someone who is trying to live a spiritual life, are women an impediment to progress? I would say usually, but not always. Ram Dass used to say that the only legitimate reason for a spiritually oriented person to marry is if being married is helping you to live a spiritual life. For example, you find a woman who's wiser than you or equally spiritually inclined, that kind of thing, then having a woman in your life can be helpful. Also, there is the famous saying attributed to Socrates, I think, that by all means a man should marry. And if he gets a good wife, he'll be a happy man. And if not, he will become a philosopher. So there's that too. But for a lot of people, a lot of men, women are pretty much of a necessity. Just because we are instinctively attracted to a woman, or to women in general, I guess. It's like, I think it was Carl Jung said that we're just like a man is just evolved and adapted to being in a relationship with a woman, pretty much like we're adapted to having certain like percentage of carbon dioxide in the air we breathe. It's just, we are just evolved for that. It is true that lately, the past less than a century of the existence of Western civilization, I suppose, that women have become liberated. We've got women's liberation, which has really thrown a wrench into thousands-year-long dynamic between men and women, where like the man is the boss. There's a certain limit to the amount of crap he is required to take, that kind of thing. And so it has really destabilized male-female relationships, especially in the West, And that's just going to have to get worked out somehow or other. Because the way it is now, like women, a lot of them want a career. They don't want to have kids. At least half of marriages in certain countries result in divorce. So the civilization is unlikely to prosper so long as this kind of destabilized male-female dynamic is still active. So something's going to have to get worked out. And I wouldn't hold my breath. It may take a while. Also, for some reason, I'm reminded of a story by J.D. Salinger called Teddy, about some enlightened little kid. I mean, he's born and raised in New York City, and he's got this completely dysfunctional family. His parents are just like fighting all the time. They apparently don't even like each other. His sister is just horrible. Just this little kid, and he's enlightened. And he explains to someone that he would have gotten enlightened in the previous life, but he got involved with a woman in the previous life. So it caused a delay of one lifetime. But as I say, if a woman is helping you in your spirituality, if for some reason you're just having the woman in your life is helping you to develop spiritually in whatever way, it may even be that you've got certain karma that needs to be worked out. So, or you need the woman that helps you to be a philosopher, maybe. You know, there's different ways. But in general, I mean, I suppose I should also add that some guys just can't be celibate. They're just too horny. And even some guys who are celibate, I mean, they're just like consumed. They're just burning with lust all the time because it's sort of like a starving man thinking about food all the time. So in a case like that, then you may as well just defer to nature to some degree if it's just too much of a cross to bear, too much of a strain to be celibate. In which case, find a good girl, a good woman, I should say. You know, settle down, be faithful to her, be faithful to each other. But as a general rule, if it's possible to be celibate, that's what the Buddha says. That's like the official position of Theravada Buddhism. Like the Buddha says, you know, if you're able to be ordained as a bhikkhu, get ordained. If you're not capable of that, then at least avoid sexual intercourse like a person would avoid falling into a deep pit with burning coals at the bottom. But if even that is too much, if you can't handle even that much, then just at the very least, avoid the wives of other men. But, I mean, ancient Indian ethics were extremely strict. Much stricter than like Christian ethics, for example. So the ancient Indian ethics, like the cultural milieu in which Theravada Buddhism arose was this very, you know, the world is a bad place. You need to find your liberation from samsara, and that is done through renunciation and celibacy and strict adherence or strict morality, this kind of stuff. And so Theravada adopted that point of view. It's not the only possible point of view. And most of the people who are famous for being enlightened in the West tend to be married. I think Eckhart Tolle is married. Nisargadatta Maharaj was married. Some of the sages of the Upanishads were married. Although it could be largely fictional, like the dialogues in the Upanishads. So, I mean, to some degree, you're just going to have to decide for yourself. I mean, do you really need to have a woman? Have you already made like a lifelong commitment to a woman? In which case, I mean, if you're like a person who believes in God, and you have stood in a house of God and solemnly vowed before God that you will stay together through better for worse till death do you part, then that's a serious consideration. So many people, I mean, they will make this solemn vow to stay together for the rest of their life. And then 3 years later, they're getting divorced because of like finances or something, or the woman just thinks she can do better. You know, she's just vaguely dissatisfied and thinks she can do better than this guy. So I hope I answered that question. It is kind of a touchy one for some people. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question. And he asked this question more than a week ago, and I just found it in my inbox because he asked it in an email. Emails are not the best way to ask me questions for Q&As because usually I don't get questions for Q&As or Q's and A's, Q&A videos in my email. And so a lot of the time I don't even think to look in my inbox for questions for the next Q&A. So anyways, Fred says, is a stream enterer a true man who knows the ropes? And again, I've expressed a certain skepticism for the whole 4 stages of Aryahood many times. I've written about it. I've talked about it. And I really do not think that the 4 stages of Aryahood, with the Sotapanna or stream enterer being the first stage of the 4 stages of Buddhist sainthood, I don't think that the Buddha really taught this. That originally a stream enterer was probably like the Buddhist equivalent of like a born-again Christian or just like a new convert to Buddhism. That was probably what a stream enterer was a new convert to Buddhism who had just entered the stream of Dharma, had just started interpreting their life along spiritual lines. And there were certain considerations, like there was an obscure rule in the Patimokkha rules that monks should not be overly reliant upon a family of Sotapannas. And that makes more sense if you view Sotapannas as new converts who might be rich in faith and might just like impoverish themselves trying to offer stuff to the monks, especially if the monks are not ashamed to be asking for lots of stuff. So a stream enterer, going with Orthodox Theravada, you could go along with Fred's interpretation that a stream enterer is a true man or a true woman, true boy, true girl who knows the ropes. Who, in other words, who's pretty much like locked in, who knows what's what with regard to how to live their life along dharmic lines, that kind of thing. Although if a stream enterer is just a new convert to Buddhism, like a devout new convert to Buddhism, not just some person dabbling, being eclectic, just investigating a little bit, but someone who's really, really just convinced that this is the right way for me and their life is changed, then even then they don't necessarily know the ropes. They may still be relatively naive with regard to a lot of stuff that is taught in Buddhism. And I think I answered that question well enough. So I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from PSA. And PSA, again, he asked these questions more than a week ago. He says, could you talk in more depth about this same question? I keep going back to it because if your mind is distracted now, it makes sense because you're currently living the life of a householder. But how did you lose your unification of mind as a monk? What happened? Could you please elaborate when you started to lose this singleness of mind as a monk, and what methods did you use to try to get it back before disrobing? So this is a question that I'm getting asked, or variations on this question. I'm getting asked almost every Q&A now. I don't know why that is. Could be just coincidence. But let's see here. What is the exact question? How did I lose my unification of mind as a monk? Well, it wasn't something that you could really see clearly as to what exactly was causing it. It's just that my meditation just stopped being as good as it was for whatever reason. And partly, it just started getting into this is just ridiculous. My concentration or my meditation was never, I mean, I've never been by nature a really good meditator. You know, it took a long time before I could start getting into relatively deep meditative states. And even then, it was sort of like Godika in the Godika Sutta, where he gets it and loses it and gets it and loses it and gets it and loses it until he's at wit's end. And finally, he just self-deletes because he just can't stand it anymore. So, I mean, it was kind of that sort of thing. And I remember reading in a book by St. John of the Cross, I think it was The Ascent of Mount Carmel, where someone who gets contemplation and loses it, gets it and loses it, gets it and loses it, you know, they're able to practice high contemplation, as the Catholics call it. And then you just can't get it anymore. The best you can do is just meditation, which has like visualizations or, you know, perceptions going on. When you get into high contemplation, like either, you know, Catholic high contemplation or the higher jhanas in Buddhism, then you're no longer thinking. Your mind is just clear and silent for the most part. You know, there might be little motions, but that's as far as it gets, is little motions. And according to St. John of the Cross, if you get it and lose it and get it and lose it and get it and lose it, you don't just, you know, finally master it, then, well, God has other plans for you. And he had a lot of experience with this. He was like a meditation master teaching Catholic contemplatives in a contemplative order. He had a lot of experience. And I mean, from his point of view, apparently, based on his own experience, if you don't just, you know, get it and keep it, but you just get it and lose it, get it and lose it, get it and lose it, then apparently just God has other plans for you. And that's the way it was for me. I'd get it and lose it, get it and lose it. And then finally, I just stopped getting it, except for just the occasional little glimmer. You know, maybe one good meditation in just a matter of months. And it was just so frustrating, just going back to the ABCs, going back to labeling, that kind of thing, that it just started becoming discouraging and disillusioning to some degree. And then I just decided, well, I mean, after 10 years of meditation that is below what I was doing like 2003, more than 10 years, time to try something else. So let's see, how did you lose your unification of mind as a monk? It's just the mind just is restless, maybe a little contracted, and then you just start losing enthusiasm because it's so unreliable. There's kind of a question farther down the scroll that addresses that particular issue indirectly that I'll probably touch upon this a little more, but it's just unreliable. You know, it's like you try and try and try for years and years sometimes, and then sometimes you get a glimpse or a glimmer. Other people, they can try for years and years, meditate for years and years, and never get anything above first jhana. You know, they just never get beyond like thinking and perceiving as like their main meditation technique. You know, they still have this method that they're following. You never just kind of break free of methods and just get into this clear, silent spaciousness. And for me, I'd get it sometimes, and then finally around 2004, it just kind of tapered off and almost stopped happening. So what happened? I mean, sometimes anyone who's done like an intensive meditation retreat can know that your subconscious mind can fight against enlightenment or fight against Dharma, just sabotage your practice. And because it's subconscious, you're not fully aware of what's going on. It can be like hysterical symptoms, that kind of thing. That happened with Catholic saints too. So there's always that. And you can see the surface stuff, you know what's going on at the surface, but what's going on deep down in the murky depths of your subconscious mind, which is where a lot of this stuff is originating, you know, troubles with your meditation, that kind of thing. Sometimes the best you can do is just make an educated guess. Or you can just resort to St. John of the Cross's explanation. God just has other plans for you. So could I please elaborate when I started to lose the singleness of mind? Well, I mean, even at my best, it wasn't like every single minute of every time I would sit down to meditate. Back in those days, for most of my career as a monk, I was meditating several hours a day, sitting cross-legged with my eyes closed, usually several hours a day. And I mean, sometimes your mind is restless and doesn't settle down. Sometimes you get right into it and it's just beautiful. And so, after around 2003, 2004, it's just restless and not settling down very well anymore. I mean, you can kind of grind away at the technique, but I mean, it's like going back to the ABCs after you had something that was much higher, more advanced than that can be discouraging. So let's see. I mean, I've really answered this question pretty much in the previous Q&A, and then also like 2 or 3 Q&As before that. So I shouldn't just keep flogging a dead horse here. See, what methods did I use to try to get it back before disrobing? Is just continuing to meditate. Went to a few retreats, but it was by then, after several years of it, I mean, you just it becomes like habitual, just this not having momentum going, not having enthusiasm for practice, because just the expectation that the practice is not going to get very deep, that kind of thing. It just kind of derailed the whole holy life attitude, I suppose, or at least contributed to the derailing of the holy life attitude. I just got as far as I could get with it, and then it leveled off and even started tapering off. And so after several years of that, time to try something else. I'm going to take a drink of my beverage. That's good. So I guess I should just move on to the next question. This is also from PSA. He says, for monks stroking it without emission, is it considered breaking the 3rd precept? And does the monk have to confess it? Well, the monk isn't dealing with 5 precepts. He's dealing with Vinaya rules of monastic discipline. So we're dealing with the first Sangha di Sesa rule here. And according to the first Sangha di Sesa rule, to deliberately have an orgasm is a Sangha di Sesa offense requiring 6 days and 6 nights of penance, followed by this very inconvenient reinstatement ceremony in which at least 20 monks in good standing have to attend. And it's really inconvenient. But there are minor rules that are associated with the first Sangha di Sesa. For example, if you try to have an orgasm and for whatever reason fail, I'm pretty sure that's a tulachaya offense. It's at any rate, it doesn't rank as a full Sangha di Sesa. So let's say you start and you're like have the intention to have an orgasm and then change your mind. Well, still you were doing it with the intention, which is, the action and the intention. That's 2 out of 3. You didn't actually accomplish it, but still you did the action with the intention of doing it to completion, and then you didn't complete. So I'm pretty sure it's either a dukkha or a tulachaya offense, but it falls short of a full Sangha di Sesa. So just confession is enough. You don't have to do the penance and all that. Or let's say you start and then like somebody starts walking in, so you suddenly stop and pretend, everything's cool, that kind of thing. Then it would be against the rules. But if you're just not exactly spanking the puppy, but just petting it, and then it just accidentally goes off, which can happen, then that wouldn't technically not be breaking a rule. But if you're not sure, you're like second guessing, trying to psychoanalyze yourself, then just to make sure, you may want to do penance just to clear all doubt. just to make sure you've got a clean slate, that kind of thing. And a lot of monks do that sort of thing. I've done that sort of thing before, not only with regard to Sangha Disesa number 1, but like touching a woman with like desire, desire to derive pleasure from the touch. There was one of the abbots, one of my main teachers in Burma. He would do the penance every year because sometimes women would touch him. It's like just brush up against a woman on a bus, or for whatever reason, you come into contact. And he was kind of a macho monk, and he enjoyed it. So just to make sure that he was clean, ritually clean, he would do the penance pretty much every year. So in order to commit Sangha Disesa number 1, then you have to like perform the act physically. You have to have the intention of having an orgasm, and then you have to successfully have the orgasm in order for it to be a full Sangha Disesa offense. And all of the Sangha Disesas are like this. In fact, a lot of Vinaya rules are like this, where there's lesser rules with regard to like trying and then not actually succeeding in breaking the rule. But the very fact that you tried to break the rule, like even with regard to like stealing, that kind of thing, then it's a lesser rule, but not like the full penalty. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mark. Hi, Moki. This is from Mark, and he says, who were your favorite wrestlers from Portland wrestling back in the early to mid 1970s? And it is true that when I was a kid, starting when I was in about 5th grade, my family started watching big time wrestling, also called Portland wrestling, but really it was in beautiful Lake Oswego, which is next to Portland, I guess. And it's true. Sometimes I would like cheer for the bad guys just to irritate my mother, because my mother really believed it. It's a lot of this stuff is fake. They're like bashing each other with metal chairs and this kind of stuff. Jumping out of the ring and just beating each other up out on the parking lot sometimes. And she thought it was all just 100% legit. But even as a kid, you could see that a lot of it was just sort of fake, dramatized, fake blood, this kind of thing. So my favorite wrestlers from Portland wrestling back in the early to mid 1970s, beautiful Lake Oswego. Well, I mean, Dutch Savage and Jimmy Snuka were like the two heroes. Those were like the two main favorite good guys. I remember one of the bad guys was Bull Ramos. And the very first time I ever saw, what's his name? Jesse the Body Ventura, who was in some relatively big movies, like the first Predator movie. And also he was, governor of Minnesota or something like that. First time I ever saw him, he was the new tag team partner for Bull Ramos. And he was just silent. And Bull Ramos is like slapping at him on the stage. They're up in the crow's nest talking to the host, Frank Bonema. And Bull Ramos, this big fat Indian guy, is just slapping at Jesse Ventura saying, pose, pose. Because Jesse he's just adopting these, Mr. Universe poses. That was back when wrestlers were kind of making the transition from diesel powered to nuclear powered. So, I mean, I could say like Haru Sasaki with the dreaded karate thumb, definitely diesel powered old fashioned wrestler who was just kind of built like a weightlifter or something. Tough Tony Bourne. With regard to bad guys, well, that's the next question here. So, yeah, I mean, Dutch Savage and Jimmy Snuka was pretty much everybody's favorite back in those days. And then Mark here says, who was your favorite bad guy? And I don't know, I suppose it was, what was his name? Lord Jonathan Boyd, one of the kangaroos, the royal kangaroos. Because he was a bad guy, but he was tough. I mean, he was genuinely a good wrestler who maybe just, they had to like draw lots to see who had to be the bad guy or something. And so he and his tag team partner, what was it? Charles, Lord Charles? No, not Lord Charles. Something Charles. But they were tough. I mean, they could take a beating. They were good wrestlers. Sometimes they would win. So let's go with Lord Jonathan Boyd, who was this Australian guy. And I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, if ultimate awareness were truly static, would that not contradict the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence? ? Buddhists say that everything has changed from when I was 5 years old until now, but if the capacity for awareness or pure awareness itself has not changed, why could that not be considered an Atman or self? Well, I mean, I thought I was fairly clear in my explanation of my answering of Austin's previous question, which was kind of along these lines. This is like a follow-up. He says, I was saying that human awareness in the samsaric sense is not static, but ultimately, like the highest state of awareness, like assuming, for example, that nirvana is pure formless consciousness, you could say that that is static, partly just because it's no longer in time. It's timeless, akaliko. So it doesn't contradict the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence, because the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence, like in the three marks of existence, sabbe sankhara anicca, which is all conditioned things are impermanent. But when you go beyond like samsaric awareness into this hypothetical ultimate highest absolute awareness of pure formless consciousness, it's not a sankhara anymore. It's not in samsara anymore. But Buddhism really doesn't, it tries to avoid, or at least early Buddhism wisely avoided reifying the absolute. So, you don't even refer to the highest state as an it or a thing or like a goal. You don't really try to describe it. You can have it as a goal and so forth, but still it has to be like practically like an enigma. Man, that was hard to say. Or just a mystery. Like mysticism. Mystery and mysticism have the same root, the etymological root. So, kind of you can say that assuming that nirvana is infinite formless consciousness, this unmanifest, luminous all around, like some ancient verses say, then you could say that that kind of ultimate awareness would not be impermanent, but it's off the scale. It's not a sankhara, so it's not contradicting sabbe sankhara anicca, or all conditioned things are impermanent. But when you're at the human level, still in samsara, everything is changing from one moment to the next. So, there are some Mahayana Buddhists who will say that this infinite formless consciousness is like the origin of like the Buddha nature and all that, and it doesn't change. And so you can call that your true self. But in early Buddhism, you don't call anything your true self. That's just sort of a later Mahayana philosophical development that is emotionally satisfying to certain types of people. So, I'm just going to move on to Austin's next question. He says, nama, which is usually translated as mind, he says, nama is considered immaterial, meaning it doesn't have mass or physical extension. Consciousness arises dependent on conditions, but it is not reducible to matter. If computers could become conscious, consciousness could arise from purely material structures without anything immaterial. Would this not be a huge problem for Buddhism? Well, it'd be a huge problem for Abhidhamma philosophy, because I've said this before. One time I asked a Burmese Abhidhamma scholar, would it be possible for a computer to become conscious? And he just gave this unconditional no, because according to Abhidhamma, consciousness has to arise in kamaja rupa, or matter that is generated by karma. And computers apparently don't have that. But personally, I do not see any problem at all that you could argue that consciousness arises from a brain, which is a kind of organic computer. It's still matter. A brain is still matter, at least from a materialistic point of view. So, I really don't see a problem. It would be a problem for certain tenets of Theravada Buddhist orthodoxy because of what Abhidhamma says, but most Westerners don't have much use for Abhidhamma anyway. I certainly don't. Most Buddhist monks, Western Buddhist monks, do not take Abhidhamma very seriously. They do not consider it to be genuine teachings of the historical Gautama Buddha. So, if you're like a Mahayana Buddhist who doesn't believe that matter even really exists, then, where would the problem be there? You wouldn't have mind originating from pure matter because according to like a Yogacara Buddhist of the Mahayana, then there is no pure matter. So let's see here. Did I answer the question? Nama is considered immaterial, meaning it doesn't have mass or physical extension. Consciousness arises dependent on conditions. Well, yeah, that's Vijnana Kanda arises dependent on conditions. Yeah, we can say that. But if you're talking about nirvana as infinite formless consciousness, then it's not arising dependent on conditions, because that's just transcends samsara, it transcends conditionality, and it transcends the duality of existence and non-existence, so that you can't even really talk about it. So if computers could become conscious, consciousness could arise from purely material structures if you believe that physical matter is ultimately real, and I don't. Without anything immaterial, would this not be a huge problem for Buddhism? It would be a huge problem for some like Orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophers and maybe certain other Buddhist philosophers of other schools who are dogmatically attached to certain tenets found in Buddhist texts. But overall, I don't think it would change much at all with regard to, is Buddhism true or not? With regard to how to practice and all that, it would remain unchanged. Four Noble Truths remain exactly the same, regardless of whether computers can become conscious or not, or regardless of whether a blob of gray meat can become conscious or not. According to Orthodox Theravada, your brain isn't even the organ of thought. It's like thought just arises through the force of karma in the blood in one of the chambers of your heart. Hadaya Watu, the heart base is where thought and mentality arises according to Orthodox Theravada. They didn't even know what the brain was for. In the Visuddhimagga, the brain is just a big lump of bone marrow filling a large hollow bone. Almost the only thing that your brain does, according to Buddhaghosa and the Visuddhimagga, the number one commentarial text in Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, the only thing that your brain really does is if you catch a cold, it starts to liquefy, and so the snot coming out your nose is like melted brain, according to the Visuddhimagga. As Venerable Nyanamoli, the first famous Nyanamoli who translated the Visuddhimagga into English, as he said, the commentators were hard put to find a use for the human brain because they had already decided that your heart was the organ of thought. They really didn't have an idea of like blood circulation at the time that they came up with these ideas. And so apparently they had this idea that it was your liver that was responsible for splashing your blood around in your body, causing it to somehow circulate through this splashing activity. So, you really can't take ancient Buddhist or ancient Indian ideas about the function of the brain or the function of the heart or the function of the liver. Like, you can't take them too seriously. There are some people, of course, that think ancient Indians, they knew everything better than modern science does. And with regard to how the mind works, maybe. But with regard to human anatomy and physiology, there's no way. Unless you had some kind of enlightened doctor that just had like this transcendent understanding without really conceptualizing it and writing it down in medical texts. So, let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to the next one. This is from Maximin. And Maximin says, in holding your views on politics and the war effort, do you consider the fear and dread young men face who could be drafted? And then in parentheses, he says, I'm 27. And my view on politics and the war effort is mainly like objective, like political analysis. I'm not trying to interpret like world politics in terms of Buddhist ethics. In Buddhist ethics, almost all politics is immoral, which is why a devout, serious Buddhist is supposed to just renounce society and go off and live alone in a forest. If you just like abolish all military, all wars, this kind of thing, even wars of self-defense, punishing criminals, this kind of thing, you consider all that to be immoral. Even like killing lice in your children's hair, if all that, you're just not going to do that, you're not going to break any precepts at all, then the thing for you to do is just go off into a forest, renounce the world, and just go out and live the holy life. So in holding my views on politics and the war, I don't really consider very much the fear and dread young men face who could be drafted. And if it arises, especially when I'm thinking politically, not just being like empathetic and subjective and thinking like in terms of Buddhist ethics, but I'm thinking in terms of politics, then fear and dread of young men, that's fatal to a society. If you have, there's always going to be a lot of young men who just don't want to fight, or they're afraid to fight, they don't want to get killed, this kind of stuff. But if you don't have any men who are willing to fight for their country, the country's doomed. And at present, the United States at least has an all-volunteer military. So, it's like nobody's being drafted at present. Anyone who's getting killed in the military volunteered to join the military, knowing full well that there was a chance, a risk of being killed. So, I can't really consider that to be any kind of injustice any more than somebody knows the risks of smoking, they decide to smoke anyway, and then they get lung cancer or emphysema. Or they decide they want to be a motorcycle racer, and they know in advance there's always the hazard, you can get in a wreck, you can get killed. But they decide to take that chance and they go for it. And then if they if they get killed in a wreck, God forbid, at least they were willing to take that risk. And in their particular case, they rolled snake eyes but they willingly rolled the dice knowing that it could come up snake eyes. So the fear and dread of young men who even in the old days, there would be a draft. Sometimes the army would just go through just recruiting all the young men in a certain village. That happened a lot. And as a general rule, the men might be very afraid, full of dread, but still, when you get thrust out onto that battlefield, it's like this innate manhood, this innate heroic virtue just rises to the surface, and you just find it within you to fight or to do your duty. So my father was in World War II, and he would say there are some people that, I'm not going to fight, I can't kill anybody. Then, when you've got Germans or Hungarians or whatever shooting at you, then you just find it within yourself to start shooting back as a general rule. Most of the people that said, I can't do it, I'm not, I'm afraid of getting killed and all this, most of them would come around and start fighting. And some of them would be good fighters. Once the ice was broken, once they finally found the inner warrior, the inner Viking or the inner Saxon or whatever came to the surface, which is what grown men have been doing since the human race existed. I mean, there was a time when almost every able-bodied man in a village was a warrior, if necessary. Your village or your tribe gets raided by another village or tribe. You pick up your spear and you go fight to protect your village. And it was back in those days, it was like with spears, like people looking at each other in the eye as they're killing each other. Unless maybe you were lucky enough to have a bow and arrow and standing farther back. So I think excessive fear and dread of young men, just fearing having to go to war. I mean, in a way, it's a sign of societal decay. Sorry to say, I don't want to insult anybody. I mean, you have the option of just refusing, just be a conscientious objector. And I remember there's a book by J. Krishnamurti where somebody was complaining to him, I think it was an Indian man, saying that if you don't join the army, they'll shoot you. I mean, if they draft you and you refuse to fight, they'll shoot you. And Krishnamurti says, okay, you still have the choice, so you'll be shot. That's just something you just got to consider. Still, you make the choice. If you prefer to get shot or whatever it is, go to prison rather than fight in a war, I mean, still, that is your choice to make. In accordance with your karma. Well, I mean, I can relate. When I was a young man, I was sort of a militant pacifist. And I definitely did not want to join the military. I came from a military family. Most of the males in my family, especially my father's side, had been in the army. But I was just a militant pacifist at the time. Dope smoking cosmic cowboy with long hair. And I just didn't want to do that. So, I mean, if they would have drafted me, then I would have had to, I mean, they didn't have the draft back then. There was like a mandatory registration for selective service, which I eventually wound up doing due to my father just insisting on it. So I signed up for the selective service and they didn't draft anyone. It was just in case. But if I had been drafted, then it may have been that I would have just had to decide, am I really willing? I mean, you can be like Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi. He volunteered to join the military in World War I on the British side as an unarmed stretcher bearer. He was at least going to do his part. He was not a coward. He was going to do his part. He just didn't want to kill anybody. So he was just running out onto the battlefield and pulling wounded soldiers to safety without shooting at anybody. So, I mean, that's an option too. I mean, if you're just afraid, then that's probably not so good. But at the very least, I mean, if it's just a moral decision, you don't want to kill anybody, which is, I mean, that's not a bad choice to make. Then, I mean, still you could be like an unarmed stretcher bearer or something. I don't know if that's really an option in the modern American military. I mean, possibly like a combat medic. Something like that. I think combat medics in World War II, at least they carried a pistol. They didn't have a rifle, but they still had a sidearm. I mean, I don't know if you'd actually be required to use that. I mean, you could just leave it in its holster. So getting back to Maximin's actual question, it's kind of surprising to me that Maximin is asking this kind of question, considering that Maximin was like the first barbarian emperor of Rome, allegedly. He was just a complete animal. He definitely was, I mean, he rose up through the ranks of the legions, he became emperor that way. So, yeah, I mean, when I have views on politics and the war effort, it's just from this amoral, objective, what is expedient from a political point of view kind of attitude. And so there's not a whole lot of, I mean, it's really cut and dried from a Buddhist point of view. War is murder. Just don't do it. Don't kill anybody. Don't even kill an ant. Period. That's it. It's really not negotiable. But I mean, from a political point of view, just observing, what Donald Trump and the Ministry of War and all this is doing, I mean, you can't really just insist that we just disband all of our military forces and all this just because it's not dharmic. I mean, it's just unrealistic. So it's more of an anthropological kind of a thing when you're looking at politics and, what is conducive to the prosperity and success of a country. And just not hurting anything is really not conducive to the prosperity of a country. Not for very long anyway. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovac and Sipad Zidana. And I alluded to this question in answer to one of the first questions. Siovac and Sipad Zidana says, thoughts on this quote. And it's a quote from Terence McKenna. And Terence McKenna says, the thing that is so powerful about the psychedelics is that they perform on demand, which almost in principle you cannot expect of a mystical experience, because that would be essentially man ordering God at man's whim, which is not how it's supposed to work. And this is something that I used to consider a lot. Like a little while ago, I was talking about how with meditation, getting like a mystical experience through meditation, there's no guarantees at all. Some people might try their entire life and fail. And then other people, you get it and lose it, get it and lose it. A lucky few or fortunate few will master it. And then they can just slide right into a deep mystical state pretty much every time they sit down. There are people like that. I assume St. John of the Cross was one of those. A lot of Buddhist monks, both Theravada and otherwise, have been that way also. But, I mean, I can't really agree. I mean, let me back up a little bit. So, I mean, meditation, getting into deep meditative states or mystical states through meditation, as I say, is woefully unreliable sometimes. There's no guarantees. Whereas something like 2 hits of acid, you take those 2 hits of acid and you're pretty much guaranteed of some kind of mystical experience. At least in my case, it has generally been that way in my youth. So, I mean, I used to think about that a lot when I was a monk. It's like, man, it's like you can just take 2 hits of acid and you'll be getting into states that some meditators have tried to get into for decades and have failed. So it's almost unfair that it's so reliable with something like psilocybin mushrooms or mescaline or LSD, that kind of thing. Whereas with meditation, it's not nearly as reliable. But what McKenna's talking about here, it's like, let's see, it would be essentially man ordering God at man's whim, which is not how it's supposed to work. Well, I mean, not how it's supposed to work is just sort of a cultural thing, I think. Because even like somebody who is practicing diligently and they've got like a talent at like contemplation so that they finally master it. I mean, still, I mean, they're working at it. They're making efforts. It's not just like this gift of God that's just spontaneous. It's not purely divine grace even then, because they're really striving for it. You know, they're really putting in the effort, putting in lots of effort. So it is true that it seems kind of vaguely unfair, unjust, that some people can meditate and meditate and meditate for years and still not get into a mystical state as deep as if they just took a bunch of psilocybin mushrooms. I think I mentioned previously, not long ago, that some Hindu yogi or Swami back in like the 1970s made the observation that God came to America in the form of LSD because Americans are materialists and they wanted their God in the form of a material substance. So, I mean, it's all just. I mean, just going with, cosmic justice in a Buddhist sense with karma and all that, then everyone gets what they deserve, even though it may not seem that way, especially if it's like innocent children being abused and so forth. From the Buddhist point of view, it's a karmic thing. Anything that happens to you and causes any kind of sensation, positive or negative, is the fruition of karma. If not karma made in this life, karma made in a previous life. And, a lot of people that really cannot appreciate the whole idea of karma, we'll call it victim blaming, and just get indignant and angry about abused children and so forth. And I can get that, but still, I mean, I do accept the idea of karma, that the world we are living in is mind-made. Like the first verse of the Dhammapada, it's mind-made. Mind is chief. Mind is the forerunner. And some people just aren't very good at like generating their reality. It's like even good people can have nightmares. Just, we're creating our own dreams, and some people are creating nightmares. But I'm wandering away from the question and from the Terence McKenna quote. And I gave my thoughts on it. So I'm just going to move on to Siovakchan Sipat Zidana's next question, which is a surprisingly difficult one. He says, who is your favorite American of all time? And then he says, writer, philosopher, mystic, politician, and any other fields you think are important. So my favorite American of all time, I guess I can just cheat and say my dad. My dad is my favorite American. But just getting into these categories, like my favorite writer, my favorite American writer. I mean, America really hasn't produced any like great like Shakespeare's that I'm aware of. I mean, Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick. I mean, Moby Dick is great. It's more profound than the Old Testament of the Bible, for example, in my opinion. I mean, it is profound. It is a mystical text in certain respects. Like Moby Dick himself is like the left fist of God. But then again, Melville wrote a lot of kind of not so good stuff. In fact, most of his stuff wasn't all that great. He's kind of like a one-hit wonder. I mean, his second best writing would be maybe Billy Budd. Like some of his early stuff, like Taipei. It's readable. It's interesting, but all in all, he was inspired with Moby Dick. He was inspired by a muse when writing Moby Dick, even though even Moby Dick has some corny parts. But I mean, Melville lived a really interesting life. I mean, he's like of the Dutch aristocracy of New York City, going back from when it was New Amsterdam. And then his family fell upon hard times back in the 1800s. There was some kind of depression or stock market crash or something back then. And so he just went off and started working on whaling ships. And Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, was actually one of the harpooneers. He's the guy standing in the front of a rowboat chasing a sperm whale, like hurling the harpoons into the whale. So, I mean, he definitely lived an adventuresome life. And so that causes me to have a little higher opinion of him, even though he wrote a fair amount of duds. With regard to like poetry, I don't know if America has had very many really great poets. Robert Frost, maybe. Let's see. My favorite American philosopher. I mean, America hasn't produced any really great philosophers either that I know of. Some good scientists, but maybe William James. Like he wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience, which is more religion than philosophy. I guess with regard to philosophy, William James was mainly known for being one of the founding pioneers of pragmatism, which was one of the theories of truth. It was kind of a epistemological theory that something is true if and only if it works. My favorite American mystic. Well, there's Herman Melville, again, who wrote Moby Dick, that's definitely a mystical book. Or also maybe Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote the poem Brahma. Brahma is a good mystical poem if you've never read it, and it's short. I think it's only like 3 verses long. My favorite American politician, let's go Theodore Roosevelt, which may help to explain why I like Trump as much as I do. I like someone who just gets shit done. And let's see, in any other fields I think are important. Gosh, I really can't think of very much. I mean, musicians, my favorite American musician, I don't even know. Johnny Cash, I don't know. Let's see. So, yeah, I mean, with regard to my favorite American of all time, I'm still just sticking to my dad. He was a great man in his own way. And, yeah, I mean, if Siovac and Sipad Zidana is not satisfied with this answer, he can, ask a specific category in future. And, maybe I'll have more time to reflect on it. Because really, I'd have to sit here just really thinking about, gosh, who is my favorite American philosopher, for example? You know, there's a good chance I'm overlooking somebody. So let's see here. I mean, if it were English or Scottish or something, it'd be easy. I could just, my favorite Scottish philosopher obviously would be David Hume. Favorite English philosopher, I don't know, maybe F.H. Bradley. But, I mean, the great rock and roll bands, Led Zeppelin, for example, that's English. The Beatles were English. Best American rock and roll band, I don't even know. Pink Floyd was English. Rush was Canadian. Maybe The Doors, I don't know. Let's just move on to the next question. This is also from Siovac and Sipad Zidana. This is more philosophical, more Buddhist, if you will. He says, in Theravada, why is delusion considered a sankhara rather than perception? I thought perception was the way you see the world, while delusion is incorrectly seeing it, thus making it making it a form of misperception. Well, this is another Abhidhamma thing. That first of all, according to Abhidhamma, there are 52 mental states. All of them are sankharas. And then for some reason, 2 of these sankharas, which are sanya or perception, and also vedana or feeling, got singled out because supposedly they're more important than the other 50. And it's bad, categorization, bad systematology, in my opinion. This is indicative of early Theravada Buddhism being pre-logical, being a product of Indian culture before formal logic had really been established in Indian philosophy. So it's just, you can say that you've got the 5 khandhas, and that is it. That's all we are. And Sankhara Khandha would just be volition or will, in which case all these other mental states, even wrong view, is considered to be a distinct, qualitatively separate mental state, just distinct from perception. And that kind of stuff, I just can't buy it. You're better off just saying perceptions and will. Perception and volition, even feelings would be a kind of sensory perception. So yeah, I'd go along with that. You've got mental states or just perception and volition and consciousness. But even that is getting too complicated. So, at one point I did write the first Buddhist philosophical essay I ever wrote was with regard to trying to make sense of the 5 khandhas and trying to make sense of how perception and volition especially are related. How perception is like the static aspect of volition, and volition is like the kinetic aspect of perception. So that even that is a false distinction. It's just based on the weird way, like the grammatical way that human beings label things and identify things. And I'm probably confusing some people because I'm slightly confusing myself trying to answer this and just kind of going about it scattershot. But in Theravada, delusion is considered a sankhara rather than perception, mainly because you had these Abhidhamma scholars trying to categorize everything and not doing a really good job of it because they were not particularly sophisticated with regard to formal logic. They didn't really have a really solid system. And so they're just coming up with this kind of mental state. Yeah, we'll just call that an ultimate reality. And that kind of mental state, yeah, we'll just call that an ultimate reality. And then they'll just like come up with other mental states that you're not even fully aware of, but they have to be there to kind of fit the theory, kind of the way some subatomic particles are theorized or hypothesized by theoretical physicists just as a way of getting a theory to work. And so Abhidhamma was kind of that way. But I would say delusion is perception. In fact, I would say delusion and perception are synonyms. Might as well throw samsara in there. Samsara is delusion, is perception. Perception is samsara. So, I mean, I go with a much simpler way of interpreting the world than Abhidhamma scholars with their, gosh, I don't even remember, what is it, 128 ultimate realities? No, it wouldn't be that many. It's 28 kinds of matter, 52 kinds of mental states, plus one kind of consciousness and one kind of nibbana. But I just don't, I'm like a monist. You know, you start off with this undifferentiated, like plenum, I guess, and then perception just starts differentiating. I mean, that's papancha. Just starts differentiating this undifferentiated ultimate reality and just sort of forming individual essences out of it. And that's all just artifacts of perception. So a lot of this is one of those cases. I think one of the very first questions, like Fred was asking about Sotapannas, I have to give two different answers. I have to give my own personal best answer, and then I have to say what Orthodox Theravada says, because they don't always agree. Sometimes I'm in agreement with Orthodox Theravada, but other times I've got to give two different answers because Orthodox Theravada says this, but I can't really accept that. I don't think that's true. Because I don't just follow along with my religion like a lot of people do. So, yeah, so, I mean, in Theravada, delusion is considered to be a sankhara rather than perception just because you have these Abhidhamma scholars just trying to just divide the entire universe up into its constituent elemental parts. And they just didn't have the common sense, apparently, to realize that delusion is perceptual. I mean, they would freely admit that there has to be perception involved in delusion, but then there's this delusion-tron that has to be added to the perception-tron in order to form the full mental state, which also has to have all these other trons that are in the rupa kalapa. It's like a molecule of all these little particles of mental states and matter and all this. And I just can't buy it. And most Western Buddhists don't really have any use for this sort of thing. It's just ancient Indian philosophy from a time when formal logic and a certain sophistication of thought had not yet entered Indian philosophy. I mean, you don't really need sophistication of thought if you're just practicing mysticism. You're getting into these deep mental states where you're experiencing reality directly without having to theorize about it. Then you can still be fully enlightened without having formal logic, without having some sophisticated theoretical framework to account for the mental states you're having. I hope that this Q&A isn't just me just rambling in just various directions and not giving a straight answer to anything. It's kind of how it feels sometimes for some reason today. Maybe just because I'm sitting in a different place than usual. So let's just move on to the next question. This is from the Saboteur. And the Saboteur says, the vast majority of people around the world accept that their governments are ripping them off in the form of taxation, high prices, poor quality social services, etc. Does that mean that karmically in some future life, we shall be either rich or generally better off, or perhaps it's already our karma to be ripped off? Yeah, it's already our karma to be ripped off, assuming that we are ripped off. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the vast majority of people around the world accept that their governments are ripping them off. I mean, some people are just naive and they think their government is great. Some people are just, they'll just attribute it to well-intentioned, inefficient bureaucracy, and they don't want to think badly of their government, even though they will admit that it could be better. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, this question is kind of a strange one here. So the vast majority of people, according to the Saboteur, let's just say lots of people around the world believe that their government is ripping them off. That they're being treated like livestock, which is kind of true. So does that mean that karmically in some future life we shall be either rich or generally better off? No, because your karma is, whatever is happening to you is the fruition of karma. It's not creating new karma. Anything that's just happening to you. Your reaction to what's happening to you is creating more karma, which will have its fruition afterwards. So, yeah, if you feel that you are being ripped off by your government, that is the fruition of karma, not the creation of new karma, other than your feeling, your belief is making new karma, which may reinforce that the government ripping you off in your estimation. So yeah, it's already our karma to be treated this way. That's why we're treated this way. And that's just the way government works. I did read this one book, I think it was called The 10,000 Year Explosion, talking about the acceleration in human evolution once we developed agriculture. And the book points out that before we developed agriculture, we were more or less the equivalent evolutionarily to a wild animal. But once we developed agriculture, which then resulted in sedentary settlements and then chiefs, they probably chiefs in the Stone Age, but still like hunter-gatherer Stone Age. But you start having governments, start having kings and laws and temples and armies and this kind of stuff, that human beings underwent an evolutionary metamorphosis into a kind of domesticated animal. So people really have been, over the course of history, treated like livestock, treated like a farmer treats his own livestock. Kind of a resource to be exploited. You try to make sure that they're safe. You don't want wolves to be eating your sheep, that kind of thing. You want your sheep to be healthy. So you put forth efforts to keep the sheep, healthy and relatively secure until it's time for you to start butchering them or whatever it is. And it is our karma to be a kind of domesticated animal. And it's been that way for the past 10,000 years, at least 10,000 years starting in the so-called Fertile Crescent, like the Levant and like southeastern Anatolia and getting down into like the Tigris-Euphrates plain area. So, Yeah, that was the saboteur's first question. The saboteur's second question. Can negative karma be at least partially neutralized by performing good deeds, such as leaving your last will and testament to a Buddhist organization? Well, you don't really, you can't eliminate bad karma through some act, like a priest blesses you, or some Taoist priest waves a paper wand at you, or some Catholic priest, blesses you and says you're forgiven, or Jesus of Nazareth, says you are forgiven, or, the priest tells you to do some kind of penance, Hail Marys and Pater Nosters, that kind of thing. And then it's like your bad karma is cleansed, by making confession that you are cleansed of your sins. That doesn't happen in Buddhism. No. So the closest you can come to that, there is a kind of simile or parable given in one of the Pali Suttas. I don't recall exactly which sutta it is, where the Buddha, I've mentioned this before. The Buddha compares all of your bad karma to a handful of salt. So you take the handful of salt, you pour it into a cup of water. You can't drink it because it's so salty that, the water is so salty you can't even drink it. But you take that same handful of salt and pour it into a pool of clear water, and then you dissolve it all in there. Then if you drink the water, you might hardly even taste the salt because you diluted it way down with pure water. So the Buddhist way of dealing with bad karma is you dilute your bad karma down with lots of good karma. So instead of pouring the handful of salt into a cup of water, you're pouring a handful of salt into a whole pool of water, with that water being sort of the metaphorical equivalent of good karma. Doing good deeds kind of dilutes down your bad karma, but it doesn't make it go away. The salt is still there. The only way that you can get rid of bad karma is either by just allowing it to reach fruition, over which you really don't have much control, or if you just avoid the opportunities for your bad karma to reach fruition, sometimes, according to Buddhist philosophy, that karma will just eventually fade out. So if it's like your karma to be trampled by an elephant or something, you just avoid elephants long enough, there's a good chance that karma will eventually just fade out, just expire. But there's no guarantee of that. It might be that some 100 years in the future, you might still get trampled by an elephant. So don't just fling yourself underneath elephants, assuming that your karma of being trampled by an elephant has been exhausted. So let's just move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, it is said that artists, writers, and creative people in general are prone to having mental health issues. Do you think there is an actual link between creativity and mental illness, or is this just a kind of myth? If you do think there is such a link, why do you think this is the case? And before I answer, I'm just checking to make sure we are in fact recording, and we are in fact recording, which is good. So yeah, I do think it's a stereotype that artists are nuttier than the average person. And most stereotypes have a basis in truth. This also reminds me of, there's an English saying, I don't remember the exact words, but it's that genius and madness come very close together. That the greatest geniuses also tend to be kind of nutty. Like Nikola Tesla, for example. He was a genius, but he was also kind of nutty. Like he had like these weird kind of phobias about, like he couldn't stand seeing a woman's neck, that all the women that worked for him had to have like these really high collars concealing their neck. He couldn't stand like jewelry on a woman. It just kind of freaked him out somehow. But like artists and just creative people in general tend to be liminal. It's like there has to be like a break in the structure. If you're just completely regimented, you'd have like no originality, no creativity, because everything's just kind of locked into place. And so you're very predictable. It's just kind of almost robotic. Just a complete normie, no imagination, just very predictable, then you're less likely to be considered weird or eccentric than if you've got like these kind of windows in the structure of your mind through which like intuition and creativity can emerge, that you can be possessed by a muse more easily, let's say. So you're going to be liminal, and there's going to be a less rigid structure to your mind. There's going to be more loose ends, more kind of, I don't know, kind of weird twilighty places in your mind maybe, and that you have access to. That's where you're having original ideas. It's coming up from some kind of primordial chaos. It's not coming from rigid structure. And so the more exposure you have to this like primordial chaos kind of stuff, the more likely that this really kind of abnormal stuff is going to come through. And so, I don't think it's any kind of stretch at all. You go to a university, you go like check out the law students, the pre-med students, the business administration students on the one hand, and then go over to like the drama students and the art students. And you're going to find the drama students and the art students are going to be more irrational and just more eccentric than like the STEM students, the mathematicians, that kind of thing. But then if you have like a really inspired genius with regard to mathematics, let's say, he's going to be more eccentric than just, the kid, like maybe the East Asian kid whose father insists that he'd be like an engineer, so that his ancestors will be proud. So yeah, I do think that there is an actual link between creativity and mental illness, or between creativity and just eccentricity, creativity and just sort of unpredictability and like non-conformity. Because a lot of people that are considered mentally ill, you can't have like some kind of real, like some kind of mental illness that is like some kind of organic flaw in your brain. Like obsessive compulsive disorder, it's like a genetic thing. So that would be different, I think, at least a little bit different. But people that are just considered to be just wild, nutty people, a lot of them are just sort of original thinkers who are following their own idea instead of conforming to the traditional culture. So, yeah, they're more interesting too, in my opinion. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskazis. This is kind of an easy one. Cherzaskazis says, Jesus' most inner circle was that of James, Peter, and John. Who was the most inner circle of Buddha? Well, the Buddha's two chief disciples were Sariputta and Moggallana. So they would be the top two, I think. And then probably you could throw in Ananda, who was the Buddha's personal attendant in the Buddha's later years. Ananda really wasn't the Buddha's attendant in the Buddha's early years. He had at least two other personal attendants that are named in the texts. But as the Buddha was getting older, probably more in need of a personal attendant, then his cousin Ananda, whose family name was also Gautama, became his sort of his companion, just was pretty much with him most of the time. So yeah, the inner circle, at least in the Buddha's later years. I think that Ananda and Sariputta and Moggallana, they knew each other. That Moggallana and Sariputta died before the Buddha did, and Ananda survived the Buddha. So they weren't all together at the same time all the time. But yeah, I guess the top three of the Buddha's inner circle would be Sariputta, Moggallana, who were his two chief disciples, and also Ananda. Maybe Mahakassapa, but Mahakassapa was kind of a loner. He went off on his own a lot, probably much more than Ananda did. But Mahakassapa was the senior monk in the Sangha after the Buddha passed away, because Sariputta and Moggallana, as I say, passed away before the Buddha did. They're probably older than him. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. Next person. This is Paschetti. And his first question is, Stevens? That is the first question. Stevens, ? And I really wasn't exactly sure what he was getting at. So I asked if that was really his question. And then he pointed out that Stevens, who I've done a few videos with, and is a member of the Discord server associated with like these Q&As and just stuff that I've done, that he has deleted all of his videos. And I didn't notice that. So Stevens may have deleted all of his videos. He's kind of gone offline or off the grid a little bit. He was talking recently, well, a few months ago anyway, about just moving onto like a farm, just kind of living a rustic life for a while. But why he deleted all of his videos, I don't know. Some of his videos were somewhat controversial. Maybe he just decided it was time to move on to something else, but I've never really discussed this with him. And I didn't even notice that he had deleted all of his videos until Paschetti here said that he did. But I guess he's still alive and well. He made some comment on the Discord server. I think it was less than a week ago. So he's still around, I'm pretty sure. He's just, why he deleted his videos, I'm not sure. So let's just move on to Paschetti's next question. I think I spelled his name wrong. I think it's Paschetti and not Paschetti. So let's just do that. Let's just fix this. We don't want to mispronounce Paschetti's name. Okay, Paschetti says, a rum and monster energy swilling pirate is attacking guided meditation. Defend it, sire. And I understand what he's talking about. He's talking about Styx Hexenhammer 666, who, he's like an ex-Satanist who, he's really into like the occult, but he made his claim to fame. I mean, he originally got famous through occult stuff and also through like describing his experimentation with various intoxicants, that kind of thing. That was before my time. But by the time I started watching Styx Hexenhammer 666, he was giving political commentary on YouTube. And he had a grasp of the big picture that was better than most people, including most political commentators on YouTube. And so I used to watch his show. I mean, I didn't have much interest in his occult stuff that he still occasionally produced, but his political stuff I generally appreciated. But then he started crashing out. I think for starters, he got married to a Dutch woman. He lived in the Netherlands, had a child there, and then they had a parting of the ways. And so he came back to America and just started like associating with like women of questionable repute and sanity, and just started like drinking and probably like taking other intoxicants at a very high rate. And he just started crashing hard, and the last I heard, I mean, as of today, he is hiding out from the police. He's got a warrant for his arrest for some kind of domestic violence charge. And then also just at this point, probably also like contempt of court and evading arrest and that kind of thing. So he's hiding out in some woman's apartment, I think, in New York City. And the woman is allegedly mentally disabled. So, and he's got like a broken tooth now because one of the other women that he was associating with just punched him in the mouth and broke his teeth. That you can see the police, like, what is it? The badge camera? What is it? Live camera stuff. I can't remember what it's called. You can see that kind of stuff on the internet. There are people who are avidly keeping up with all the gossip on this guy. He started wearing a pirate hat, even when he's arrested, even when he's going to court. He's attending virtual court hearings like through Zoom or something, still wearing this pirate hat and the broken tooth. And it's just, he's pretty much lost credibility. And now, just recently, he did a video where he is just sort of giving his opinion with regard to guided meditation. And I mean, before I even get to what his decision was on the subject, and I didn't even watch the video, but apparently Moschetti says he was attacking guided meditation. I mean, he's just kind of lost credibility with regard to wisdom. I mean, he cannot get his own life in order. He seems to be crashing out hard. There's a good chance that he's going to be going to prison in New Orleans due to some domestic violence thing originally. And then like shooting, like possession of a firearm and shooting a firearm while like already having like a restraining order and maybe like some charges against him. And it just gets worse and worse because, I mean, he really does not have responsibility. I mean, one thing I've noticed about him, even when I liked him, is, or, you know, when I was still like taking him more seriously because of his sober political commentary, that, oh, where was I going with this? I lost the thread. What was I going to say? That's too bad. I forgot what I was going to say. Sometimes I have such long sentences leading up to my point that I just get distracted and forget what the point I was aiming towards. But I mean, oh yeah, is even when I considered him to have like a good grasp of the big picture, he always seemed to be like without a moral compass. You know, he was always kind of amoral. He had like a morbid sense of humor. He liked gross slasher movies, this kind of stuff. You know, he just, I don't think he would be a very nice person. But now it's really caught up to him. And it's just, he has lost credibility. And he's trying to tell people, you know, how to live their lives when he obviously is just going downhill fast. He is on a toboggan ride downwards. And a lot of his videos, he is just obviously just stinking drunk, for example, with a tooth missing from getting it punched by a woman that he was living with for a while. Wearing the pirate hat, hiding out in a different town so that he won't get arrested, et cetera, et cetera. And it is too bad because his grasp of the big picture is now kind of blurry due to his overindulgence in alcohol, mainly, I think. But also the spell is broken. You know, he had like kind of like this, I don't know, call it charisma or something, a mystique that, I mean, he is just kind of destroyed through really bad life decisions and just irresponsibility. And it's too bad. But with regard to guided meditation, let's get to guided meditation. Let's just leave sticks, hex, and hammer aside now. I don't like guided meditation either. I've never liked guided meditation. It's like somebody's getting inside your head and telling you what to think. No. If I'm going to meditate, I'm just going to meditate on my own without having to listen to somebody else's words. And when you're listening to somebody else's words in a guided meditation, you're not going to get very deep because you're always going to be at the verbal level. You know, you're still listening to what somebody else is saying and processing that. You're still very much at the verbal level. You're never going to get very deep in the meditation. And besides, I just do not like people telling me, you know, what to think, what to visualize, anything like that. So I actually agree with Sticks, Hex, and Hammer if he does not like guided meditation, because I don't like it either. But even so, Sticks, Hex, and Hammer 666 has pretty much lost his credibility. And it's, I personally do not really enjoy kind of juicy negative gossip about people. I mean, it's kind of interesting sometimes if you remain objective about it, but I don't really revel in seeing somebody, even if they're destroying their own life, even if they're messing up their own life, still, I really don't get satisfaction from, like observing that. If the bad guy in the movie eventually gets shot or something, that's kind of satisfying. But he's just like this kind of a two-dimensional, symbol of evil. Whereas, he's not like a genuine human being in the movie. So anyways, let's just move on to Paschetti's third question. He said, would you kindly beam metta at one of the questioners and not tell them? And yeah, I've already done that. In fact, I was doing that yesterday. So that was easy. Let's move on to the next question. This is from Watermocker. And Watermocker says, dumb question, but I want to hear your answer anyway. And there are no dumb questions. There are only dumb people. That's just a joke. That was a bad joke. Watermocker says, did Siddhartha follow the rules of monastic discipline on his way to becoming the Buddha? That's not a dumb question. Even if there are dumb questions, that wasn't a dumb one. So did Siddhartha, Siddhartha, it's not found, that name is not found in like the earliest Buddhist texts. In Pali it would be Siddhartha. And speaking of which, I'm just going to totally digress here, that I finally got another job. I report to work. My first day of work is this coming Monday, working in a metal shop again, which is good. And after I've already, passed the P test, signed the papers, I've already got this job. Somebody named Siddhartha is trying to hire me for a different job. But, it would be some Indian HR department, maybe. HR department that maybe even stationed in India for all I know. So, I just thought it was kind of, kind of mentionable, remarkable, in the sense of worthy of remark, that somebody named Siddhartha wants to hire me, but it's already too late. So let's just get back to the question now. Did Shakyamuni follow the rules of monastic discipline on his way to becoming the Buddha? Well, technically, the Vinaya rules did not exist in the Buddhist time. He had not formulated Vinaya yet, but he probably did follow a lot of those rules, just because a lot of the rules of monastic discipline for monks was just like common etiquette or protocol for the renunciants of the Ganges Valley in ancient India, like approximately 5th, 6th century BCE. So like only eating in the morning and wearing robes and shaving your head, or different schools would have different ways of dealing with the hair. Like the Jains would just pull it out. I think the Brahmin priests, a lot of the Brahmin priests would just have like dreads, they just grow it long and not do anything with it until it was all dreadlocks. But there were certain rules, celibacy, this kind of thing, that were common to various spiritual practitioners in the Buddhist time. And so he was probably following along with a lot of this just tradition of how ascetics were supposed to live before the rules of monastic discipline were devised. And according to tradition, it was years before the Buddha even started making rules, because at first the monks were like veteran spiritual heavy hitters. They didn't need these rules. They would just, of their own volition, they would just conform to the tradition of ancient Indian spirituality. And, you didn't have to make this rule that this is a rule of such and such category that is expiated by such and such ritual. It wasn't necessary yet. But then as Buddhism became more popular, you had people with less pure motives joining the Sangha. And so some of them were kind of rascally. And so the Buddha started having to make these rules. That's according to tradition. Although it's also possible that there were no rules at all until after the Buddha died. And then at the first council, they formulated a kind of patimokkha rules just to have structure. Now that the founder was gone, they were going to have some other kind of structure holding things together. tradition says, the Buddha laid down the rules as there was a need, but also tradition says, like if you read the history of the first council, that after the Buddha passed away, after he reached parinibbana, the enlightened monks, they accepted it with equanimity. But a lot of the unenlightened monks were grieving because, their teacher had died. And then you had this old monk who was ordained when he was old. So he was kind of set in his ways and not easily trainable. He's saying essentially, why all the long faces? Now we can do whatever we want. We don't have Venerable Gautama saying, do this, don't do that all the time. And then Mahakassapa, who was senior monk in the Sangha after the Buddha's passing away, he heard this, and then he realized, if that's the attitude some monks are going to have, we're going to have to lay down some rules. And so the first council is also called the Vinaya Sangiti, or the convocation of monastic discipline. So it's possible that there really were no Vinaya rules until after the Buddha passed away. And one of the purposes of the first council was to establish rules to kind of stabilize the Sangha so that it doesn't just dissolve and peter out after the founder is gone. So, but again, he probably did follow certain just established protocols and traditions that most of the renunciants were already following at the time. And I'm going to move on to Watermocker's next question. He says, likely it's not possible for us in modern times to do what he did to become enlightened back then. Ought one attempt doing what he did if the goal is enlightenment? I understand that his conclusion was that the extremes he went to don't work, and the middle way is his prescription, but those extremes did work in a roundabout way for him. So the actual question here is, ought one attempt doing what the Buddha did if the goal is enlightenment? And if you're in a Buddhist culture, a Buddhist country, and someplace like Thailand or Burma or Sri Lanka or maybe Cambodia, where, the flora and fauna and the climate is relatively similar, and even a lot of the culture is similar to the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time, you can live the way ancient Indian monks lived. That's what I was trying to do in Burma. So it works in like a Buddhist culture, in a kind of Buddhist environment, to follow the traditional Buddhist way works fairly well. You bring it into a Western country, like into the temperate zone, it doesn't work nearly as well. Especially, just the weather is different. So you're going to have to probably break rules. If it gets down below zero, you're going to be having to be wearing thermal underwear and socks and shoes and all this kind of stuff, which are technically against the rules. But also you can't just live under trees and wander around in Norway or like Massachusetts, maybe to a limited degree, but just to take up that lifestyle in the West is much less likely to be successful, let's say. So, yeah, if you're in a Buddhist culture, in a Buddhist environment, following a traditional Buddhist path is about your best bet. But if you're in a non-Buddhist culture, a non-Buddhist environment, some secular Western culture, for example, it's not necessarily going to be your best bet. It's still not a bad choice to be a Buddhist monk in the West, but it's going to be very different. There's going to be a lot of concessions and compromises made. You're going to be living a relatively luxurious lifestyle, not very ascetic, for example. But then getting to this other part that Watermocker was saying, see, I understand that his conclusion was that the extremes he went to don't work, and the middle way is his prescription, but these extremes did work in a roundabout way for him. Yeah, it was necessary for him, I guess, although it could be that if he had known, there was already a Buddha teaching him, how to practice, he probably wouldn't have almost killed himself through like starving himself and that kind of thing. So Yeah, I mean, it seems like following the teachings of an enlightened being on how to become enlightened would be about your best bet, especially if you're in a culture that is more or less in harmony with the instructions given by the enlightened teacher. If you can find an enlightened Western teacher who isn't just a charlatan, but is genuinely enlightened or at least extremely wise, then they might be able to guide you about how to navigate through Western style samsara better than Gautama of the Shakya clan who lived 25 centuries ago. But with regard to meditation techniques, what your mental state should be like, still the Buddha's advice is good. But trying to live according to ancient Indian monastic discipline is, it fits ancient India to a large degree. It still fits Theravada Buddhist culture, but you get out of Theravada Buddhist culture and you're a stranger in a strange land. So I think I answered his question, although I didn't fully address his comments after his question. But there was no question mark after that, and it would have added a question, which would have then been transgressive because he would have asked more than 3. So I'm just moving on to his next and third question. He says, also, I've heard you say that you think it is likely that the few enlightened people of the modern day, I forget the time frame you gave, were or are Hindu. If someone were to ask your advice about the most likely path to becoming enlightened in modern times, would following Hinduism be part of your recommendation? And this is a misunderstanding. I never really said that the few enlightened people of the modern day were or are Hindu. I would say that over history, I would not at all be surprised if there have been more enlightened Hindus than enlightened Theravada Buddhists. I have said that. I'm not insisting that that's the case, but it wouldn't surprise me if there have been more enlightened Hindus than enlightened Theravada Buddhists. Partly because Hinduism is more open, it's less rigid, and so there's more kind of personality types that can adapt to like different approaches in Hinduism. It's more broad spectrum. Whereas Theravada Buddhism is more narrow, and so it's going to kind of weed out certain personality types. And a lot of the people that do follow Theravada Buddhism are going to be rigid dogmatists who, like with regard to Romeo's question, just lack the inspiration. Because you're a rigid dogmatist, you're just kind of locked in to this rigid system, and there's not much room left for inspiration. You have to have a certain originality to become enlightened, it seems to me. You have to transcend the rigid structure, because the rigid structure is like a mental prison. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there have been more enlightened Hindus, but I'm not insisting on that. So, let's see. If someone were to ask your advice about the most likely path to becoming enlightened in modern times, would following Hinduism be part of your recommendation? If you're going to follow a spiritual path in India, Hinduism might be the way to go. If you're going to follow a spiritual path in Burma or Thailand, Theravada Buddhism might be the way to go. If you're trying to become enlightened in 16th century Spain, Roman Catholicism would be your only choice, and so you'd have to just make do with that. Medieval Europe in general. So, with regard to modern America, you might be better off with someone like Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti, or maybe even U.G. Krishnamurti, who, they were born into a Hindu culture, but you could hardly call either one of them a Hindu. So, yeah, there might be a certain radical iconoclasm that might be part of a Western approach. You can look into a lot of the sort of Western enlightened teachers or teachers claiming to be enlightened. And J. Krishnamurti would be a good start with regard to that. And his approach is fairly good for Westerners, I guess. And I guess he still has a kind of, I mean, in his memory, he's long gone. But I think like Ojai, California, there's still like a Krishnamurti community living there. There's like a Neem Karoli Baba based community, like sort of his old disciples living in Taos, New Mexico, I think. You can sort of find isolated communities following various paths. But it could just be a matter of your own karma and a certain amount of like chance, you want to call it that. Just who's going to be the first enlightened teacher or the first really like believable kind of spiritual teacher that really vibes with you, really resonates with you, where you can just say, yeah, I can follow this. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be Buddhist or Hindu or anything else, especially in the West. So let's see, what's the actual question here? If someone were to ask your advice about the most likely path to becoming enlightened in modern times, would following Hinduism be part of your recommendation? Not necessarily. I mean, you can read the Upanishads, read the Bhagavad Gita, and see if that really rings any bells for you. You can read the Sutta Nipata, see if that does anything for you. Read like the Heart Sutra, see if that does anything for you. A lot of people, they'll just read the Bible, and that's good enough for them. At least you're going to have the culture supporting you. And in the West, at least in America, or Eastern Europe. So, yeah, I mean, your best bet would be just be eclectic and like be a student of all religions. And this is essentially what I did. Is just read the scriptures of various religions, just consider the teachings of people who are claimed to be very wise. You know, Eckhart Tolle, see if he does anything for you. And then whatever it is that really resonates with you the most deeply, go with that until it stops working, and then maybe try something else. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, because we've already been going at this for almost 2 hours. Next question is from Scudamane. And Scudamane says, so my mom is super Christian and she's asked me to read Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm struggling to get through it, to be honest, and I don't know how I'm going to break it to my mom when we talk about it. Ha ha. His engaged Buddhism is social justice warrior propaganda in the guise of Buddhism. He even has his own version of the precepts. The first precept, for instance, he says should be to refrain from killing, but also to prevent others from killing. The second is not only to not steal, but to share. My official question on the matter is this. So we're getting to the question here. What is your opinion on the following quote from the book? Quote, if while we practice, we are not aware that the world is suffering, that children are dying of hunger, that social injustice is going on everywhere, we are not practicing mindfulness. We are just trying to escape, unquote. Well, I mean, that's certainly not Orthodox Theravada, anywhere near to it. Like, let's see, Scudamane is saying, to some degree, that is like social justice propaganda with Buddhist flavoring. Although it goes a little deeper than that. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh was relatively serious in his Mahayana, heart-oriented Buddhism. So he was definitely kind of a karma yogi who wanted to like help people, even though according to like early Buddhism, you know, first you have to get out of the building. The building is on fire. You've got to escape from the building, and escaping from the building is really the only sensible thing to do. I mean, staying in the building out of compassion to treat the burn victims while the building is still on fire and you still don't know how to get out. I mean, it might be well-intentioned, but it is not really the wise choice. The wise choice is find your way out of the burning building. And then after you've found your way out of the burning building, then if you see fit, you can come back in and try to help other people get out of the burning building. But as a general rule, most people don't even know the building is on fire. And they don't want to get out of the building. So, if while we practice, we are not aware that the world is suffering, that children are dying of hunger, that social injustice is going on everywhere, we're not practicing mindfulness, we're just trying to escape. Well, I mean, that's, to be aware of that is fine. That's the first noble truth. To exist is to suffer. So the world is suffering, yes. First noble truth. Children are dying of hunger, yes. First noble truth. It's always happened. Social injustice is going on everywhere. Yes, that's first noble truth. This world is never going to be perfect. There's always going to be suffering in any version of reality you live in until you get fully enlightened. And even then, there's going to be like the superficial appearance of suffering so long as you superficially appear to have a body and a personality. So yeah, I mean, you can be mindfulness, you can be mindful, be aware that the world is suffering, that children are dying of hunger, and that social injustice is going on everywhere. But that doesn't mean you're supposed to just get up and go out and try and fix it, because you're not going to succeed. You might make things a little better, but we're living in a world of dualities where you fix one thing and it's just going to cause some new bad thing to crop up. So, yeah, be aware of it. Yeah, first noble truth, definitely. Be aware that to exist is to suffer. But that doesn't mean that you have to go out and try and fix it. I mean, you don't contribute to it. You don't make things worse on purpose. You know, it's like think globally and act locally. It's like, fix yourself. That's the best you can do. And if fixing yourself will help other people. But that's your top priority. Just get out of the burning building. So I guess that's good enough. I hope it is. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Crash Metta Religion. And Crash Metta Religion says, are you familiar with the religious scholar David Bentley Hart? He claims he is Eastern Orthodox, but he is really a syncretist. He is extremely well versed in all world religions, not just Christianity. He has a form of Christian belief that many call Vedantic Christianity. I am seeing more and more of him, but I have been aware of him for years. If you are familiar with him, what are your opinions? Well, this is an extremely easy question to answer because David Bentley Hart sounds kind of familiar, but I don't think I've ever heard a word that he has ever said. So I really cannot contribute to this particular discussion because I don't really know who David Bentley Hart is. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're kind of getting down towards the bottom here. This is from RFS. And RFS says, which pāramī is the most important for spiritual development? And according to Theravada Buddhism, there are 10 pāramīs. And when I was a monk, I came up with this dumb mnemonic. I mean, it's really dumb. You'll hear for yourself how dumb it is for memorizing the 10 pāramīs in the correct order. And the mnemonic is, Dad says nasty pink vultures kept 7 angels mending underwear. So Dad, or D, is dana. That's the first pāramī, is dana, or generosity, literally giving. Then says is sila, which is morality. Then nasty is nekama, which is renunciation, renouncing the world. Then nasty pink is panya, which here doesn't mean wisdom so much as just presence of mind, having your wits about you. And then vultures is virya, which is like heroic effort. I mean, usually it's translated as something like energy, but the vir in virya is the same vir as in the English word virile, or like the vir in the Latin triumvirate. It literally means man. So it's sort of manly effort. Virya. Then vultures kept is kanti, or it's usually translated as something like patience or forbearance. I generally translate it as acceptance. Like the verb form of kanti is kamadi, the verb kamadi, which just means to accept. not to accept into your hand like taking something, but to accept something like making peace with it. So then, let's see, nasty pink vultures kept 7. That's satya, or truth. So honesty, telling the truth, not deceiving. 7 angels, A is aditana, which is determination. Just steadfast, unflinching determination, which helps in just about any endeavor, including living the spiritual life. And then mending, metta, is usually translated as loving kindness. Literally, it would mean like benevolence or friendliness. Like the Pali word metta is related to the Pali word mita, which means friend. So literally, it's like friendliness, usually translated as loving kindness. I mean, you could call it love in a positive, benevolent sort of way, just benevolence. And then finally is underwear, upekkha, which is equanimity. So the question is, which pāramī is the most important for spiritual development? And you could argue that all of them are important. I mean, it's like which organ is most important in your body? I mean, if your brain is destroyed, you die. But then again, if your heart is destroyed, you die. If your liver is destroyed, you die. I mean, even your butthole is destroyed, unless you got modern medicine figuring out a workaround, then you die. So, I mean, you could say that all 10 pāramīs are essential, although spiritually the most advanced, I mean, it goes in order of advancement. So dana, or generosity, that's kind of a layperson thing. That's like what's the word? Like elementary. And then finally you get up to upekkha, which is like the most advanced, equanimity. It's higher than metta, or loving kindness. Like in the 4 jhana system, or the Brahma Vihara system, practicing metta will get you up to 3rd jhana, according to the commentarial tradition, whereas the only one of the Brahma Viharas that would get you all the way to 4th jhana is upekkha. So for a beginner, then you start off with dana, like before you're even a monk, before you've renounced the world. I mean, nekama is renunciation. So you start off with generosity and morality before you even practice renunciation. So, it all depends on how you look at it. Which pāramī is the most important for spiritual development? Depends on what stage you're at, I guess. I mean, you can say the most fundamental would be generosity, which is just kind of getting you in a karmic situation where you're even able to practice higher Dhamma. And then, I mean, the most advanced, the most exalted of the 10 pāramīs would be the last one, which is upekkha, or equanimity. But for those of you who really want to memorize the stupid mnemonic that I came up with, I'll repeat it again. Dad says nasty pink vultures kept 7 angels mending underwear. That's the 10 pāramīs in order. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, as a half Spanish person, do people in the USA separate European Spaniards from Mexican Indian mestizo people from the former American colonies? Yeah, I think that there is a differentiation between Hispanics, which is what Edward Dutton would call a cline. It's an ethnicity, but not a race. Hispanic is not a race because it's a mixture of 2 races. It's like European, especially Spaniards, mostly from the male line of ancestry, mixed with American Indian, especially like Mexican, South American Indian, that race, I guess you'd call it, mainly on the female line of ancestry. So, I mean, you could have a Hispanic person that's 100% American Indian, 100% Mayan, for example, or you could have a Hispanic person that's 100% European, like 100% Spanish, which would generally be like of the upper classes in Latin American countries. But like pure Spanish people living in Spain, yeah, they're in a different category. I mean, lately they're just seen as loony leftists that are contributing to just the fucking up of the European Union through like socialism and just opening the borders wide open to immigrants from North Africa, which are then flooding into Europe through Spain. So Spain is, I mean, a lot of Americans, they're not really good at geography. You know, so they just know Spain is kind of over there across the ocean somewhere as part of Europe. So Spain would be seen as just kind of part of Europe, especially part of decadent Western Europe, decadent, feminized, leftist Western Europe. But a lot of Americans probably wouldn't even be able to locate Spain on a map. I think it was Ambrose Bierce that said that God created war in order to teach Americans geography. And there haven't been any major wars in Spain lately, so lately people are pretty much ignorant of what's going on in Spain. And then of Hispanic people, I mean, the ones that are like second or third generation in America that speak English with like the standard white person accent, let's say, you know, they just kind of blend in there all right, except for you see them like you're a stranger, you see them on the street and they look obviously like brown skinned and so forth. You might see them as a foreigner or a Mexican. I think a lot of people in America just consider all Latin Americans to be Mexicans. Or like someone from El Salvador. I mean, at best, they'd be like a fake Mexican. Yeah, but I do think that there is a kind of a difference, that Spain is part of Europe and it's seen as European, Western European. And then the Hispanics, the Mexicans that are like swarming the borders are, that's just a whole different kettle of wax. So, personally, I mean, Hispanics really, especially if they enter the country legally, I got no problem with them because they're generally easy to get along with, fairly intelligent. Then they're willing to work for a living. They don't just immediately go on welfare, except for a lot of the illegal ones who are like flown in the middle of the night during the Biden administration to various cities to kind of populate conservative areas with people who will vote Democrat in order to get more free handouts, this kind of stuff. That, yeah, Hispanics do have they've taken a hit to their reputation, mainly due to all the illegal immigrants that are coming in and just committing crimes, because it's a lot of gang members and so forth are included among the people who are just economic migrants. And then a lot of them are just immediately like signing up for welfare benefits, that kind of thing. So they don't have a very good reputation. Although, and it is unfortunate because a lot of the legal immigrants, you know, as a general rule, they're easygoing people who are quite willing to work for a living. And that's fine. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Robert. Okay. And Robert says, I live in a country with no Theravada monasteries and want to grow spiritually with a real community. I've mostly followed Theravada online, tried a nearby Tibetan center, and even considered Catholicism because of the mystics like Meister Eckhart and communities. What would you do in a situation like this if you don't plan to become a monk soon? Well, what I personally did, I was alone. I'm just always been a loner by nature. So I would just practice alone and read books alone. This is back before internet, back before I became a monk. So it was mainly through reading books. I mean, you can travel somewhere to do like an intensive retreat. But for the most part, I was just practicing alone, going alone like the horn of the rhinoceros, even before my ordination. I did consider just kind of being a non-denominational renunciant, just make myself a robe and get a bowl and just take off walking. But there wasn't enough. I knew myself well enough that without some kind of formal structure imposed upon me, that misbehavior was much more likely. You know, just kind of being lazy and going my own way and just indulging in my own like attachments and weaknesses and so forth, that having some structure imposed upon me, like rules of monastic discipline and a sangha, would definitely help. And it did. If there's any Zen places, some Zen places, if you've got a wise teacher, you can definitely get benefit from practicing Zen. Just doing Zen meditation is really not just radically different from practicing, Vipassana or something in a Theravada Buddhist tradition. But the most important thing with regard to any kind of local community is the leader, the teacher of that community. You can have a Theravada Buddhist community that's led by some real estate agent or insurance salesman or like elementary school principal or something, who they're really not qualified to be a teacher. Most Dharma teachers in the West, in my opinion, are not really qualified to be Dharma teachers. Some of them are just really ignorant of what they're trying to teach. But then again, you might have some Zen master or even like a Christian pastor or something who really does have wisdom and can thus help you to make progress more easily, even though it might not be in the spiritual system that would be your first choice, all else being equal. So, if you can find any wise teacher who can really help you to make progress, the system that they're in is almost irrelevant. Ideally, they would be like Theravada Buddhist, from my point of view. But you've got some Advaita Vedanta teacher who's very wise, maybe wiser than the Theravada one, just because of individual differences. It's not just because you're a Theravada Buddhist teacher makes you automatically wise, or if you're like a Christian teacher, you're just automatically foolish. It doesn't work that way. You're going to have wise teachers and foolish teachers in any system, and it's more important to find a wise, good teacher than to follow a charlatan or just some unqualified person fumbling along who just happens to be in the system that would be your first choice, just all else being equal. So, look into Zen maybe, or even like Unitarianism, some system that isn't really dogmatic, or you have to believe this or you are wrong and you're going to burn in hell kind of stuff. Who knows? You could find like a Sufi teacher. I knew this one really wise, advanced practitioner whose teacher was a Sufi, which technically is Muslim, although I doubt that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would have approved of Sufism. Or, various kinds of Hinduism, Taoism. There was a time when I was actually considering becoming a Catholic, like a Carthusian. It's like the strictest denomination or order, monastic order of Catholicism. One of the strictest is the Carthusian order. They undertake vows of silence. I was thinking, well, if I took a vow of silence, I wouldn't have to admit that I'm not really a Christian. But I would guess that even if you take a vow of silence, you have to make confession to a father confessor somehow or another, even if you're just writing it on a slate or doing hand gestures or something. So that was a dumb idea. I didn't follow through with that. But seriously, I think your best bet, if you cannot find a wise teacher who can teach you in a way that you are able to accept, then your best bet is just go it alone. And then you have a broader choice of what you're going to follow. You can find the scriptures of just about any religion online for free. So there is that. You got a wide array of teachers of various traditions that are just on YouTube channels that you can watch for free, listen to for free. So, if it's just like from books and so forth, then you try to find the wisest tradition. And, a way, like a tradition that speaks to you, that your character is in harmony with that, so that you can actually practice it and make progress. But if you're actually dealing with human teachers and human communities, you're going to have to find a teacher, especially, that is a wise and good person, not just some insurance salesman who's like a Zen Roshi in his spare time, who really still thinks like an insurance salesman. He just kind of puts on the show of being the wise Roshi when he's sitting in front of his disciples. So you have to be careful about that kind of thing, especially. And good luck. I mean, there's a saying in Hinduism, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. You know, when it's your karma to have that teacher, you're going to get it. And the teacher could just be a book. I mean, I've had times in my life where I've just been kind of in a kind of crisis state. And then just the right teacher or the right book just falls into my hands without me even having to look for it. That's happened to me more than once. But it may be that you really have to like have some kind of crisis in order to break through the rigidity of the system to allow a kind of grace to come down on you, so to speak. And I'm just going to move on to Robert's next question, which is as follows. Would you just go at it alone, having the suttas and online resources as a teacher and meditate on your own? Or would you consider a physically available tradition and possibly convert while still aiming to realize ultimate reality? Well, I've kind of already been addressing this. In my own personal case, I just went it alone. And then I just kind of made like this pilgrimage, 1,000 miles, hundreds of miles to go to like some formal retreat. So I did that at a Zen place and also at a Theravada Buddhist place when I was looking for a place to ordain. So if you're really serious, then you may want to get yourself a passport and go to a different country if you don't even have a suitable place in your own country. I mean, going to some Asian countries, once you get there, it's cheap. Living there is cheap, maybe cheaper than living in your own country once you've, paid for the visa, the passport and the visa and the plane fare and all that. Just to live in a hut in Sri Lanka or something is actually pretty cheap. So, yeah, I mean, for starters, you just kind of have to go alone. You have access to the internet, like you and I have both admitted, and look around to see what kind of teachers there are. If there's no suitable teachers, you feel like you need a human teacher, and a human teacher can be very helpful. A book isn't going to like scold you when you do something wrong or scold you for being lazy, anything like that. Just a book isn't going to do that. You have to like rely on your own initiative if you're going it alone. So for a lot of people, having a supportive group and a wise teacher who can like look into you and see where you need help and is willing to tell you what you don't want to hear but ought to hear, I mean, that's invaluable. And it may be that you're just going to consider it to be an equitable trade if that wise, good teacher is not from your first choice of spiritual traditions. So I've already said that kind of stuff. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Colmurph. And Colmurph says, can you please discuss some strategies for developing continuous sati or mindfulness? In particular, I struggle with getting into conversations with others. I find myself losing mindfulness quite easily. Should I be more actively shifting to different objects depending on the particular activity I'm engaged in? Looking for some good strategies here. Thank you. Well, I think there's more than one way I could interpret this with regard to struggle when getting into conversations with others. Colmurph maybe is trying to retain mindfulness while conversing with someone else. And that's relatively advanced mindfulness. I've mentioned before that when I was doing intensive practice, I remember one time I was staying in this building that was owned by a Buddhist supporter of my Tongpulu tradition, which I was ordained. Monks that were in Rangoon, that had business in Rangoon, could stay in this building, and he would support them while they were there. And so one time I was in Rangoon, and I'm just doing intensive practice, and I just happened to be doing walking meditation, and this old gentleman who owned the place and was supporting me came out and wanted to talk with me. And I remember I was in such a kind of a groove of mindfulness that I was having the conversation with relatively good mindfulness. It was like my main object of attention was just kind of feeling the vibration in my throat and the movements of my mouth while I was talking. And the conversation just kind of took care of itself. It was just sort of nature taking its course. It was weird. You'd think that you wouldn't be able to talk in a conversation mindfully because, you have to pay attention to what you're trying to say and what the other person is saying and so forth. But you get to a certain level and that kind of stuff just kind of takes care of itself. It's sort of like autopilot, or probably even better than autopilot, while you're being mindful of just the movement of your legs as you're walking, or the vibration in your throat, or just the sounds, mindfulness of hearing, that kind of thing. But to get to that level, you have to be practicing mindfulness with regard to everyday activities pretty consistently. So it just becomes second nature. So that when you do have a conversation, this habit, this momentum of mindfulness just continues while you're having the conversation. Reading a book is difficult. Like mindfully turning the page, that kind of thing is you can manage. But reading the book mindfully, that was even more challenging than having a conversation mindfully. So you might just want to reduce the amount of reading that you do if you're trying to have unbroken mindfulness. And also just try to keep down the amount of conversing that you do. Just try to emphasize stuff that you can do mindfully. Just live a very simplified, quiet lifestyle as much as you can. If you've got a job and bills to pay, you got people that you live with, it might not be so easy. So, did I answer the question? Should I be more actively shifting to different objects? Whatever is like foremost in your attention, whatever is the most obvious is generally what you should be mindful of, until you can get into like wide open mindfulness where you're not focusing on one thing in particular. Then it's just like a mirror or something that when it's there, it's there clearly. And, it's not obscured in any way. It's like your focus becomes like the focus of a cheap camera where everything is equally in focus, kind of a thing. That's relatively advanced mindfulness. Usually beginning mindfulness is, you're kind of labeling, you're focusing on whatever is like most noticeable at the time. And then after you get better and better at that, then you can sort of make your mindfulness more wide open, less focused. There's less looking and more just seeing, which is definitely an improvement. But you got to do it in order as a general rule. You can't just skip the elementary stuff and go directly into. You can't go directly into calculus without knowing basics of like mathematics, arithmetic, that kind of thing. So, yeah, you find yourself losing mindfulness quite easily. Yeah, welcome to the club. Pretty much everybody is that way. I think probably only a fully enlightened being would be fully mindful all the time. So, let's see. Should you be more actively shifting to different objects? Just whatever is most noticeable, I guess. There should be changes in what is most noticeable. You could deliberately make something else more noticeable in order to practice sort of a broader repertoire of objects of mindfulness, I suppose. But yeah, I guess that's good enough for an answer now. My answers are almost always much longer than the question itself. And we've been going for well over 2 hours. So, but wait, there's only one more question after this. Catches me by surprise almost every time. But I think I have semi-answered Cole Murph's first question. I hope I gave him something of value, because I'm moving on to the next question now. Also by Cole Murph. He says, why do you think the Mahayana school emphasizes the bodhisattva ideal when the Buddha taught his disciples to become arahants? I often wonder what precipitated this shift in focus leading up to the formation of the Mahayana schools. Perhaps monks of the day weren't able to attain to the level of arahant, and so they adjusted their goal. Well, before I answer that, or attempt to answer it, I'm going to break open the emergency backup beverage. And I mean, I've answered this question before. It is a shame that people don't watch all 186 previous episodes before asking questions on this one, because probably most questions that are asked, I've answered at least once before. Not all those. There's always a few questions that haven't been asked yet that I wind up getting asked. My favorite American, for example, or my favorite bad wrestler. So let's see here. Why do you think the Mahayana school emphasizes the bodhisattva ideal when the Buddha taught his disciples to become arahants? That is the big question, isn't it? And I think there are two main reasons why Mahayana Buddhism first mistranslated the word bodhisatta into bodhisattva, in my opinion, and then to sort of emphasize that to the extent of just rejecting what the Buddha actually taught, which is become enlightened in this very life if you are able. I mean, it's just amazing. Just having conversations with sometimes really self-righteous Mahayana Buddhists who justify rejecting the teachings of the founder of their own religion for the sake of following this later, just fictional stuff in a lot of cases. Pure Land Buddhism, that's even another step beyond just mere prajna paramita Zen kind of Mahayana. Because they're just flat out rejecting what the founder of the religion taught in favor of fictional teachings of mythological space Buddhas, in my opinion. But with getting back to the bodhisattva ideal, originally bodhisatta in Pali probably did not mean enlightenment being, which is what the meaning of bodhisattva. Bodhi is enlightenment, sattva is being. But satta in Pali has more than one possible meaning, and probably satta in Pali was a past participle of the verb sajjati, which means to be bound for. So a bodhisatta in Theravada Buddhism was someone who was bound for enlightenment, or in this case, bound for Buddhahood. So a bodhisatta was someone who was destined to become a Buddha. So mainly, originally, it was Gautama Buddha before his enlightenment was just called the bodhisatta. But it somehow got mistranslated, in my opinion, into enlightenment being, not just someone who is bound for enlightenment. And I think there's two main reasons why it just rose to prominence and eclipsed the original teachings of the Buddha, to the point that the original teachings of the Buddha were scoffed at as the inferior vehicle. It's just kind of amazing when you think about it. Although to devout Mahayana Buddhists, they think it's just absolutely fine and dandy because they believe, despite historical evidence, that the Buddha himself taught Mahayana Buddhism. So anyways, one reason why the whole bodhisattva ideal arose in Mahayana was the glorification of the Buddha. It's just a common thing in human nature that a religion, followers of a religion, will glorify the founder of their religion. Christianity was pretty extreme. They just glorified Jesus of Nazareth until he was literally God Almighty, the only begotten Son of God, and he is God the Son. He is the Son of God the Father, and he is God the Son with a capital G on that God. So in Buddhism, it was a similar thing. People will say, oh, the Buddha was just a human, or at least Theravada Buddhists will. A lot of Mahayana Buddhists will say there was no human being called Gautama Buddha. It was kind of like some Christian schools who believed that Jesus never had a physical body, that he was just sort of this divine apparition, just some personification of some divine force kind of a thing. God Almighty. Some Mahayana Buddhists believe that there really was no physical Buddha at all. Pure Land Buddhists can believe this stuff. But I mean, if you think that there was no Buddha at all, you should believe that there's no anybody else at all either. But getting back to the idea of the Bodhisattva, they glorified the Buddha. And one of the, I mean, as Buddhism became more popular, it became more devotionalistic because you had people that maybe weren't as profound in their thinking, and just the common person, they wanted like traditions, legends, rituals that they could feel familiar with and cling to and give structure to their lives and make them feel like they were doing something worthwhile in sort of, within the scope of their mundane version of reality. And so there was a lot of devotionalism and glorification of the Buddha. And one of the examples of this was Jataka tales, Jataka stories, which were stories of the Buddha's previous lives. And in the Buddha's previous lives, he's usually working on at least one pāramī, usually one pāramī in particular. And so because of all this glorification of the Buddha and this idea that the Buddha was purifying himself lifetime after lifetime after lifetime for millions of years, there came to be this distinction between an ordinary enlightened being or an arahant and a Buddha who was just like, radically, like just orders of magnitude beyond an ordinary enlightened being. And I do not think that the Buddha really worked that way originally. The Buddha was saying, I'm enlightened, you can be enlightened too. The Buddha himself was called an arahant. It's like Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhasa. I mean, the Buddha is called an arahant. That's just an enlightened being. And there are a few suttas that call an ordinary enlightened being a Buddha. I mean, literally, Buddha just means enlightened, awakened. But, so, I mean, originally, I think that the Buddha, I mean, his main claim to fame is he got the system going. He helped others to become enlightened, but he wasn't more enlightened than them. I mean, you just go with like logic combined with abhidhamma, kind of a strange combination sometimes, but wisdom is exactly synonymous with amoha or absence of delusion. If you have zero delusion, you have maximum wisdom. Your wisdom is perfect. So, I mean, an ordinary enlightened being has zero delusion. A Sammasambuddha has zero delusion. A Sammasambuddha may have to be more clever and creative because he's having to discover Dhamma on his own, for the first time since it had gone extinct. I mean, he didn't invent Dhamma, he just rediscovers it, but he rediscovers it based on his own genius. So he might be more clever than an ordinary enlightened being, but he's not more enlightened than an ordinary enlightened being, in my opinion. Originally, I do not think he was. But it's the glorification of the founder of the system that resulted in a Buddha being just far more exalted than an ordinary enlightened being. And then there came this idea, this is where I've been leading to. This is like the point I'm trying to get to. There came to be this idea that just being an ordinary enlightened being like the Buddha was teaching you to be was somehow inferior to being a Sammasambuddha, and therefore it is much more noble and exalted to strive to be a Sammasambuddha instead of just settling for being an ordinary enlightened being, which is kind of strange, and it certainly is not what the original Buddha was teaching, in my opinion. So that's one aspect of it. It's just the glorification of Buddha and Buddhahood, and just the idea that it's just way more noble and exalted to become a Buddha than to just become an ordinary arahant, which is like the inferior vehicle, even though that's what the Buddha was originally teaching. So these self-righteous Mahayana Buddhists called the actual teachings of the historical Buddha to be inferior. And then they came up with something better based on essentially fiction. But then there's this other reason, which is actually something that Kohlmurph here suggested. He said perhaps monks of the day weren't able to attain to the level of arahant, And so they adjusted their goal. And I do think that's another factor of why the bodhisattva idea and even the bodhisatta idea in Theravada gained popularity. It's like you had a lot of people that maybe were not all that talented spiritually, striving to become enlightened and failing. And so it just was more satisfying to them to say, well, I'm just going to postpone enlightenment, make the noble sacrifice, postpone this enlightenment that they weren't able to attain anyway for whatever reasons. And I'm going to strive to become even more exalted in the future. And there are some Theravada monks that also are, I think, possibly even the founder of my own tradition, Venerable Tampulu Sayadaw. He may have considered himself to be a bodhisatta. And then, like I've been told, Pure Land Buddhists, they actually believe that you can't even become enlightened in this world anymore. I mean, they can't do it, so therefore nobody can do it. And so the best you can do is just strive to be reborn into the Pure Land or whatever and become enlightened from there. So the bodhisattva idea also, I think, was convenient for people that either lacked the ripeness, the spiritual talent to become enlightened in this very life, or the people who just didn't want to make the effort, maybe just lazy or just devotionalistic. It was just easier for them to do the chanting and bowing instead of really just going off alone into a wilderness and meditating until they were enlightened. So, yeah, I think it was a combination of those, probably some other subtleties that I'm not thinking of right now, but I think that was essentially it. And that's it. That's the end of this Q&A, aside from the few things I say at the end. And again, don't forget, my new book is out now. It's on Amazon. The link should be in the URL links below. And like and subscribe if you found anything of value in this long rambling tirade. And what else? I guess you're going to have to look at the URL links if you look for the link to the new book. And again, the new book is autobiographical. It's less philosophical and more autobiographical than the first three books. And aside from that, I just say be happy, and I'm out of here.